Good afternoon. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the gorgeous Missoula Public Library for one of many fabulous events for Missoula Pride 2025. I know there's all kinds of amazing events competing for your attention, so we really appreciate you coming out for this one. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Anya Jabour, and I'm professor of history and also affiliated with the Public History program and the Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies program at the University of Montana. And just to make sure you are where you think you are at the Intermediaries and their allies. Yes? Woo! Okay. All right, so I'm going to introduce our panelists now, and we aren't going to sit up here until the Q&A, but I'll ask folks to stand. I've already introduced myself, and I use she, her pronouns, and I am here in my capacity as the author of a book with a title yet to be finalized that currently has the incredibly long and cumbersome title, A Revelation to Womankind, Katharine Bement Davis and the World's First Study of Normal Women's Sexuality During America's First Sexual Revolution. Thank you. Coming next year. And now I'm going to introduce an author who has a much more manageable title. So I'm super excited to be welcoming Dr. Brandy Schillace here. There's Brandy. Brandy is a whole heck of a lot of things. But I first came to know her as the host of a super fun virtual book club called the Peculiar Book Club. We, the club members, call ourselves the Peculiars. I have a book bag from the Peculiars you're welcome to take a gander at. Oh, here it is. It is currently full of Brandy's books. The octopus is the mascot, would you say, Brandy? Or member, sure. She's done a whole lot of other stuff, but if I went into all of it, we'd never get to the program. So I'll just tell you that Brandy uses she, her pronouns, and most recently is the author of The Intermediaries, a Weimar story. Yes, I have multiple copies in my bag. And they're for sale outside along with one of her novels. The first in a series, the next one is coming out. Oh, this one has a sign on it. Hang on. Here, take that thing off and show them. There it is, The Intermediaries, a Weimar story. You'll be hearing lots more about that soon. And then River, heads up, River. River also is a lot of things, but is here in their capacity as a researcher for both the Queer In and Out Montana Oral History Project, which you'll hear more about shortly, and the Crossings exhibit, which is, you're getting a sneak peek of it in the corner. There'll be some time for you to look at it in more detail if you haven't already. River uses they, them pronouns, and you're going to get to see an amazing short film that they put together in a little bit. Okay, that's who we are. Now we have some obligatory announcements. Bear with me. First, I want to give the land acknowledgement that the Missoula Public Library sits on the ancestral homeland of the Salish and Kalispel peoples. The name Missoula derives from a Salish place name that translates as the place of freezing water. This name has been used since the existence of glacial Lake Missoula and dates to the last ice age. Later, Salish people began using an additional term for Missoula that meant place of the small bull trout. These place nouns indicate historical and current indigenous relationship with the land and are critical to understanding the history of Missoula, recognizing the colonial past of Montana and upholding indigenous voices helps us to move forward into the future collectively. I also have an announcement. Thanks to Ron there in the back. This presentation is being recorded by Missoula Community Access Television as part of a grant donated by MCAT. We're very grateful for MCAT's support and also ask if you do not wish to be recorded, you choose your spot in the room accordingly. Right now it's just the back of your head, so nothing to worry about, but just as a heads up. And then I have a whole heck of a lot of thank yous. First of all, to Pride 2025, especially Devin Carpenter and Aspen Nord. Also, of course, to the Missoula Public Library for hosting us in this amazing space. Once we are at the end, we'll raise the blinds and you'll be able to see the amazing views from here. The Historical Museum at Fort Missoula, which sponsored the exhibit. Obviously, Missoula Community Access Television. 2 different bookstores, Fact and Fiction, who are here today with copies of Brandy's book Intermediaries and also her novel, The Framed Women of, is it Ardmore House? And she'll be doing an event there tomorrow. And also Shakespeare and Company, where she will be doing a very different event, which she promises funny stories about research on Monday. So if Pride Weekend isn't enough for you, wait, there's more. We have Monday coming. W.W. Norton, Brandy's publisher, Francie and John Pepper, who have generously subsidized my research on Katharine Bement Davis, an anonymous donor, and several sources at the University of Montana. The Advisory Council on Inclusive Access and Success, formerly known as the Diversity Advisory Council, the Communication Studies Department, thank you, Sarah. The Public History Program, headed by Leif Fredrickson, who could not be here today because he's out of town, but sends best wishes. And the Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies Program, Beth Hubble also could not be here because she's on a road trip with her son, who is in college. And so she was like, he asked me if I'd go on a road trip. I had to say yes. Okay, so she also sends best wishes. Okay, and now we are going to switch to my part of today. So I'll talk about Katharine Bement Davis with a little bit about Magnus Hirschfeld. Then Brandy will talk about Magnus Hirschfeld and, just as importantly, Dora Richter. Yes, Richter. And then we'll see a short film by River. And then we'll have time for Q&A, and then we'll have time to wander around the exhibit. All make sense? Yay, is right. Okay, and Brandy has generously offered to be the tech guru. Da, 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 da. So she's going to switch things around. That should be it. Yep, that's it. Huzzah! Nice job, Brandy. Okay, so I have a slightly shorter title for today. Redefining Normal Sexuality, Katharine Bement Davis, 1860 to 1935. So Katharine Davis lived a long and very full life. So I have timelines. So this is her as a little girl. Katharine, known as Kitty as a girl, was born in Buffalo, New York. She was the first of 5 children. She was fortunate enough to grow up with extremely supportive parents who supported her interests, including her interest in drama and music, which they did not share. She also had the advantage of being the granddaughter of an activist named Rhoda Bement, who was both an abolitionist and a feminist. She ran a station on the Underground Railroad, helping fugitives from slavery escape to freedom in Canada. She also was a participant in the nation's first women's rights convention, the historical Women's Rights Convention at Seneca Falls, New York in 1848. And Kitty Davis grew up hearing stories about both of these things, which inspired her to follow in her grandmother's footsteps and, as we would now say, make good trouble. During the Civil War, the family moved multiple times, including to Dunkirk, New York. Why does that matter? It will come back. After that, the family, still searching for financial stability, moved to Rochester, New York, where Kitty, now known as Kate, enrolled in the classical course at Rochester Academy. Fun story, she was the first girl to enroll in the classical course. One of her classmates said that Kitty was so charismatic that it inspired her to also sign up for the classical course. So they too took the classical course together. That means they studied Latin, among other things. In 1879, Kate graduated at the head of her class. She gave a commencement speech in which she compared the universe to a potato bin. And the people in it to potatoes who were all growing toward the light. For Kate, the light was higher education, and it took her a long road to get there. So she spent 10 years teaching in order to earn money for college, first teaching all subjects in a one-room schoolhouse in rural New York, where she introduced a drama program, and then moving back to Dunkirk, where she taught at the Dunkirk High School. She delighted her students and scandalized parents by wearing split skirts and riding a bicycle. Ooh, yes, quite scandalous. It was not scandalous enough, however, to harm her career. She made headlines when she demanded a raise, and she got it. However, this was not her life's calling. She wanted to attend college, and because of Ella Lapham, an alum of Vassar College, who she met and befriended in 1885, remember that name, we're coming back to it, she decided instead of going to Cornell, which was coeducational, she instead set her sights on Vassar College, which at the time was still called Vassar Female College. In the meantime, though, she co-founded a whole heck of a lot of clubs with Ella Lapham, including the Dunkirk Women's Literary Club. They shared an interest in literature and drama. And also the Women's Educational and Industrial Union, which was an early women's rights in the workplace and obviously education union. Then she boarded with Ella Lapham for a year while she prepared for college entrance exams. This would be the only year that the two of them would actually share a residence, although they remained in relationship for many years to come. She tested into the junior class, primarily for financial reasons, so that she only had to pay for 2 years of college. In 1890, shortly after joining the brand new pro-woman suffrage organization, the General Federation of Women's Clubs, she enrolled at Vassar College as a special student, which is what they called non-traditional students. She was 30, in case you're not keeping track. She graduated just 2 years later with honors and a specialty in food chemistry. She then taught science at a high school in Brooklyn. She did not like it because they had substandard laboratory equipment. She secretly studied at Columbia, which was an all-male institution. But of course, she did not get a degree from there. Instead, what she did was first run a model working man's home at the World's Fair in Chicago. Remember that, we'll come back to it. She did such a great job running this model home that a settlement house organizer from Philadelphia invited her to apply for a job there. And she became what's called the head resident of a settlement house called St. Mary's College Settlement in Philadelphia. Also in 1893, the Comstock Act passed. Yeah. For those of you unfamiliar, the Comstock Act literally made it a federal crime to circulate information about birth control, including both contraception and abortion, and sex ed, and, well, pretty much anything having to do with sex in the body. That was the Comstock Act. Remember that? We'll come back to that one, too. After several years at the college settlement, Davis decided, oh, now she's going by Katharine Bement Davis, PhD. No, not yet, sorry, just Katharine Bement Davis. She decided she needed to know more about the way that wealth was produced and distributed because she worked in a settlement house in a working class neighborhood and was inspired by the German socialist immigrants with whom she came into contact there. So she decided to go to the Coeducational University of Chicago, which offered fully funded positions called fellowships. So she became the first and only female fellow in the Department of Political Economy. She also, while there, got a scholarship to travel overseas from that Women's Educational and Industrial Union, which funded her studies in Europe. We'll come back to those too. And then finally, in 1900, she completed her PhD with honors, obviously. She also had a subfield in sociology. Interestingly, throughout the rest of her life, she would be known as a sociologist, even though her degree was actually in political economy. The important thing for us, though, is that she became an expert in statistics. Okay, so like most women who got PhDs at that time, she could not get a job in academia. So instead, she became the first superintendent of a brand new, it was not even open yet, reformatory for women in Bedford Hills, New York. I just call it Bedford for short, really long name. That was in 1901. Her job there was to supervise so-called wayward women. The majority of inmates were females between the ages of 16 and 30 who had committed minor first offenses, most of them so-called morals offenses. So either engaging in sex work or more frequently being suspected of engaging in sex work. So, you know, being on the streets unaccompanied without a chaperone would be enough to get you sent to Bedford. This is a really interesting position for Davis. She said when she got the position, "I will only accept it if I can run it as an educational institution. I have no interest in being the warden of a prison." It's also interesting that she was there because she had this lifelong mission to eradicate the sexual double standard, which excused men's sexual misbehavior, but punished women for basically any sexual activity outside of reproductive activity within marriage. So it's a little strange that she was put in charge of a bunch of suspected sex workers, but there you go. It was a job. While there, she established educational, recreational, and vocational programs, including, of course, an amateur drama program. She also insisted on racial integration. It might surprise you to know that even in New York in the early 1900s, racial segregation was the order of the day. This was ultimately part of what got her in trouble there. However, you can see that in this image here, all these things are on display. She believed in what one newspaper called heavy work for women. Later, they would wear bloomers instead of those long skirts. And they constructed concrete stairs and walkways. Their math classes were figuring out how to calculate the area to be covered, and then figuring out how much concrete they would need to cover that area. And then they actually did the work, and they did that in racially integrated groups, like this one here. Although Davis was a very progressive penologist, as prison reformers were called, she also became very disenchanted with her inmates' failure to reform quickly enough for her liking. So in 1909, she hired a cadre of fellow University of Chicago graduates, physicians and psychologists, to study the inmates and conduct IQ tests. It was in 1910 that the French psychologist Simon Binet's IQ tests were translated into English and began to be used in this country. Sadly, while Binet intended for them to be used in conjunction with educational level, that literally was not translated into English. And so instead of being used as a relative measure, i.e. where are you compared to your educational level, it was used as an absolute measure, i.e. as a measure of your actual potential intellect, as opposed to your current level of performance. Not surprisingly then, when Davis released a study of the first 10 years at Bedford, they also revealed concerns about female offenders' mental capacity and therefore their moral capacity, because yet another problematic aspect of IQ testing at the time was that people believed that one's moral capacity and one's mental capacity were not only fixed, like set, like that's where you are and you never improve, but also that they were inextricably linked. So if you tested low on an IQ test, and the majority of Bedford's inmates had not completed 6th grade, so obviously they tested low on IQ tests, then that meant that they also scored low on moral grounds. So, following up on that, Davis established an entity called the Laboratory of Social Hygiene with the support of the movie star handsome philanthropist John D. Rockefeller Jr., trust me, he was a hottie, to study the inmates. In 1913, she released a study in which she concluded that the vast majority, 70% of inmates, had been arrested either for sex work or for so-called public order offenses. vagrancy, public intoxication, disorderly conduct, or, being outside after dark without an escort. In 1914, Davis departed Bedford for greener pastures. We'll get to there in a moment. Her timing was excellent, since that same year there was a major sex scandal at Bedford, specifically about interracial same-sex relationships. But she got out just in time, and she told numerous papers, including the New York Times, that what was immoral was not her inmates, it was segregation. Her greener pastures were being New York City's first woman commissioner of correction. At the same time that she accepted that appointment, she became active in the state and national suffrage movements. Although Davis said that she was, in her words, born a suffragist, she also frequently tangled with the city's more radical elements, both labor radicals and also radical feminists, the kinds of folks who joined heterodoxy in Greenwich Village, for those of you familiar with that group. So one of the first challenges in her term was when she supervised the prison term for a labor activist for the International Workers of the World, the Wobblies, Rebecca Adelson. Rebecca Adelson, while in jail under Davis's supervision, became probably the first U.S. woman ever to hunger strike after an arrest for, hilariously, anti-Rockefeller protests. Not that Rockefeller, senior, but still. In July 1914, Davis was at a suffrage soiree. So instead of collaborating with the city's most radical feminists, she solicited financial support from socialites. And she was at the home of a socialite on Newport, in Newport, when there was a major riot at Blackwell's Island at the prison under her care. At that soiree, she told those that in New York, we have reformatories that do not reform, correctional facilities that do not correct. And then she promptly left from that soiree, came home, didn't even go home to change, showed up at Blackwell's Island to quell the riot, spent 3 days on site. Because she still had her parasol, people said that she subdued the riot at the point of her parasol. Not true, but funny. After quelling the riot, which she did partly by meeting with labor leaders, including Wobblies, to get their input on what made Blackwell's Island such a hideous place, which it was, she instituted several reforms, but she became frustrated with the city's refusal to do most of the things she wanted to do. So instead, she decided that she would establish New York's very first parole board, and then she became its first head. And she advocated indeterminate sentencing, meaning early release in return for good behavior. She'd pioneered that at Bedford, and she imported that system to the entire New York City jail system. However, her trials with the city's radical elements were not over. In 1916, she supervised jail time for the birth control advocate Margaret Sanger. Sanger got in trouble because of the Comstock Act, yes. And New York, like most states, had so-called mini Comstock laws, so state-level similar laws. Sanger had been running a birth control clinic. It was open for 10 days, 14 days, something like that. Hundreds of people came, then she went to jail. Sanger was sharply critical of Davis, and so was Emma Goldman, both of whom really nailed her for not supporting her sisters, as Emma Goldman put it. Nonetheless, Davis was still committed to the suffrage movement, and in 1916 and 17, she participated in the successful state suffrage campaign that ended in 1917 with the adoption of a suffrage referendum. So suffrage won, but the reform-oriented cabinet, of which Davis was a part, was forced out of office in the same election. But Davis just went back to her longtime benefactor, John D. Rockefeller, Jr., who appointed her head of his think tank called the Bureau of Social Hygiene. Rockefeller was a really interesting guy. He was movie star handsome. He was also a bit of a moral crusader. And the whole reason he started the Bureau of Social Hygiene was because he had become concerned about sex work and what we now call sexually transmitted infections in the city. So Davis's job, ostensibly, was to promote the mission of the Bureau of Social Hygiene, to repress sex work and reduce STIs. But that's not what she did. Instead, during World War I, she became involved in something called the American Plan. So this was a joint public-private program that was supposed to reduce STIs, specifically among the armed forces, to keep the men, as the saying went, fit to fight, right? Most of the American Plan was incredibly repressive. At least 30,000 women were arrested on the flimsiest of pretenses and incarcerated for years and subjected to horrifically invasive treatments that were totally ineffective, by the way. That series of state laws and federal prisons that were set up by the American Plan continued to operate well into the 1950s. You might think that Davis would have gone that route, given that she'd worked at Bedford, which incarcerated, suspected sex workers. But no, instead she decided to launch a sex ed program. It wasn't called sex ed then, it's called social hygiene. Her sex ed program was remarkable because it was scientifically accurate, and it was not filled with scare tactics. Instead, her mission was to give women honest, factually accurate information about their own bodies so that they could make informed decisions. The outcome of that was a feature-length film. It's a silent film. You can watch it, though. It's called The End of the Road. Also, toward the end of the war, she traveled through Europe for 6 months. This will also be important, to organize an international conference on women's health. In 1920, the 19th Amendment, granting many, but not all, American women the right to vote, was ratified. And that year, when the war was over and Davis was supposed to write a book on, this was the title, The Delinquent Girl, she instead decided to launch a study of what she called normal female sexuality. She also decided to establish the National Research Council's Committee for Research on the Problems of Sex. And from this point forward, she made what she called the scientific study of sex her raison d'etre. Because of that study, between 1923 and 1928, the woman who had previously jailed Margaret Sanger now became an advocate of both birth control and free speech. She secretly funded Sanger's new birth control clinic with Rockefeller's money. True fact. She also published early results of her sex study and revealed some things that we'll come back to, before publishing it in book form in 1929 under the not very sexy title, Factors in the Sex Life of 2,200 Women. In her never finished, never published memoirs, Davis referred to herself as a busy woman. No kidding. What she did not talk about, because she never wrote those chapters, was that in 1928 she was forced into retirement from the Bureau of Social Hygiene because primarily her male colleagues were really upset that she talked about masturbation. She also in that year published an article derived from her research called Why They Failed to Marry, which is a super interesting title. What's super interesting about it is that her own motivations for not marrying and for doing the sex study are probably in there in other people's words. We can come back to that in Q&A if you're curious. However, then in 1929, she published Factors in the Sex Life of 2,200 Women. At that point, she also became involved behind the scenes in the legal cases protecting free speech involving the British author Radcliffe Hall's Well of Loneliness, and also a sex ed pamphlet published here called The Sex Side of Life. We'll come back to that as well. In 1930, She moved to Pacific Grove, California with her sisters, Helen and Charlotte. Meanwhile, in the 1930s, as you'll hear about shortly, the Nazis rose to power. While that was happening, Davis was researching her family tree and drafting her memoirs and unsuccessfully searching for a publisher for her memoirs. And she died from heart disease in 1935. That's the overview. Let's look a little more detail at how she redefined normal female sexuality. So Davis was a social scientist, and she knew that in order for a study to have any impact, it was important for it to have a large sample. At this time, most studies done on sexuality at all, much less women's sexuality, were a series of very small case studies. Most of them were case studies of people who were either incarcerated or hospitalized. So they were clearly not representative studies. So Davis decided that she was going to contact what she called average or normal women. She selected them from lists of college graduates and club women. The resulting sample was not representative. It was white, well-educated, and well-to-do. But it was large. It was a total of 1,000 married women and 1,200 unmarried women. And they answered these incredibly detailed surveys, 8 pages long for the married women who were first, and 12 pages long for the unmarried women after she decided she needed to ask more questions based on that first set. So the questions were about sexual desire and sexual behavior throughout the entire life cycle. Sex play as children, sexual periodicity, which was like basically how one's sex drive ebbs and flows, both in a single menstrual cycle, but also over the life cycle. Sex instruction, contraceptive use, what she called autoerotic behavior, and same-sex relationships. At the time, the idea was that women, or at least white, well-to-do, well-educated, normal women, were supposed to be passionless, meaning they had no sexual passion, they had no sexual desire, they had no sexual drive. They engaged in sexual activity only to please their husbands or to give birth, not for any other reason. Davis's study completely upended all of those beliefs. She showed, and I'm not going to give you the figures, but they're high, that most women use birth control. And of course, their use of birth control, both contraception and abortion, despite the illegal status of all abortion and most contraception, showed that they were clearly interested in sex apart from reproduction, right? She also showed that many, again, the majority, engaged in autoerotic activity, which showed that they were interested in sexual satisfaction with no partner or reproduction in mind. And she also showed very high rates of women engaging in same-sex relationships, again showing that their interest in sex had obviously nothing to do with pleasing men. That last piece was one that got her attention across the Atlantic. So a British suffragist and feminist, Stella Brown, described her candid and courageous description of same-sex relationships. This was probably the whole reason Davis published a book and not just articles, because she had published all the other stuff, even the really shocking stuff about masturbation that got her in so much trouble, in very reputable scientific journals. The only chapters in the book that had not been previously published were the chapters on women's same-sex relationships. So this is probably why she insisted on publishing it in book form, and probably also why she insisted on having a mainstream publisher, it's Harper and Brothers. She found that 1/3 of married women and half of unmarried women in her sample study reported what she called intense same-sex relationships. And of those, half acknowledged the relationships to be sexual in nature, or 1/6 of married women and 1/4 of unmarried women. I know, right? 10%, Okay, so here's a super unflattering picture of Davis when she assumed office as Commissioner of Correction. with an article by the suffrage leader Anna Howard Shaw, Women as Public Officials. So obviously Davis spent the first half of her career literally policing women's sexual behavior, right? I mean, she put people in jail for engaging in sex work and for promoting birth control and for engaging in sexual education. And then she supervised them, even when they hunger struck. And yet, she spent the last half of her career promoting women's sexual desire. As the title of the next piece puts it, The Truth About Women. So, little Alice in Wonderland moment for you here. Curiouser and curiouser, what the heck? How did this happen? Now, sadly, because she never found a publisher for her memoirs and she gave up on them. So she never explained why her career took this dramatic turn. But I posit that there were several factors that led her to pursue the scientific study of sex, promote women's sexual knowledge, and publish factors, despite losing her job over it, and that they were personal, political, and professional. So personal factors. Her sisters were members of this group they called the 12 Perfect Little Ladies. The 12 Perfect Little Ladies avoided marriage and men and motherhood and engaged in gender role play and engaged in very intense same-sex relationships, so much so that I've written a blog post in which I said they really should be called the Perfect Little Lesbians. Davis herself was not a member of this group because she was already out of the house and working by the time her sisters joined it. But she knew them, and when she was in town, she participated in their activities. This image comes from May Bragdon, who was the official photographer for the group. Davis herself also had a very long-term relationship with Ella Lapham. May Bragdon, again, the photographer here, called Ella Lapham her particular chum. May, as you'll see, knew what particular chum meant. This relationship was tragically cut short in 1917 due to Ella Lapham's premature death. Although Davis herself seems to have never had another romantic relationship, she was extremely familiar with what one scholar calls lesbian-like relationships, since the term was not really, in use at the time, or at least not in a positive way. She knew about those relationships from her time at Vassar. She knew about them from her time at the University of Chicago. She knew about them from Bedford Reformatory. She also knew about them in Georgian Bay, which is in Canada, where many of the 12 Perfects had vacation homes. It was like this little haven. Imagine a lesbian collective, only, 100 years early. That's where that picture comes from. And in her own hometown of Rochester, New York, where May Bragdon had a very long-term relationship with another woman. There were also political factors. Davis was a lifelong supporter of women's equality. She is somewhere in this massive parade in New York City in 1915, 30,000 strong. She also had this very long-standing distaste for the sexual double standard and was extremely outspoken in her objections to it. And so it seems that this was a logical next step for her. Once women had political equality, it was time for them to have bodily equality. And then there were professional factors. So Davis was, as I've mentioned, a social scientist. She therefore was a practitioner of the scientific method, which, some of us who aren't medical historians like Brandy will think of in the very simplistic terms I learned in 5th grade. Oh, you test ideas with data. Then, based on facts, you change your theories. Ooh, that's the difference between a hypothesis and a theory. Remember that? Think back. Also, she was a big advocate of the new social scientists. And the new social sciences were based on statistics, but in the 1920s, the cutting edge trend in the US was to study normal Americans and average experiences, as opposed to the previous focus on so-called pathological behavior or deviant behavior. And then finally, looking forward to Brandy's talk here, she also was very much influenced by European sexologists. Now, some European sexologists, like Magnus Hirschfeld, were really good scientists and also really good people who thought that science was a really great way to get to justice. Not all of them were, by any means. But on this side of the Atlantic, Davis was Hirschfeld's counterpart. A tale of two sexologists. So, as you'll soon hear, Magnus Hirschfeld's papers are, well, mostly burned. But there are some really interesting points of connection between them. In 1893, when Davis was running her model home at the World's Fair in Chicago, Magnus Hirschfeld was at the World's Fair in Chicago. Ooh, interesting. In 1897, Hirschfeld established the Scientific Humanitarian Committee, which, among other things, fought against paragraph 175, which was Germany's code. Well, before it was Germany, it was Prussia, but that's too complicated. Criminalizing men's same-sex relationships. Interestingly, right after that, Davis was in Berlin, where Hirschfeld was. She also happened to be in Vienna, where some other important sexologists were, like Richard von Krefft-Ebing. And she was in London, where Havelock Ellis was. She knew all of them. In 1918-19, Davis was working on her feature film, sex ed film, The End of the Road. And Hirschfeld was working on his, Anders all die anderen, which, Hiltrud, help me here, means something like different from the others. Oh, a little typo. I should have consulted with my German friends before I made the PowerPoint. Interesting. In December 1918 through June 1919, Davis was traveling throughout Europe to recruit participants for a conference on women's health, consulted with physicians in something like 30 different cities. Right at the same time that Hirschfeld was laying plans for his Institute for Sexual Science, it depends on how you translate it, which opened in July. In 1920-21, she was launching her sex study and that committee for the study of sex. And, what was he doing? The first Congress for Sexual Reform. In 1922, she went to Europe for a vacation. She went through 10,000 pages of material for her study while she was at it. Did she also visit the Institute, which was then offering adaptation therapy? Don't know. Could have happened. In 1928, when she involuntarily retired from the Bureau of Social Hygiene, there was the World League for Sexual Reform established. In 1929, when she was citing Hirschfeld in Factors, he was hosting the second and third Congresses for Sexual Reform. In 1930, he commenced his world tour in New York City. She was in the process of moving from New York to California. Did they meet then? I don't know. In the meantime, as you'll hear, his institute was sacked, his library was burned, and they died the same year, 1935. Strong circumstantial evidence. Okay, last thing. So, you're about to learn a lot more about Hirschfeld and his clinic, and also the amazing patients that he worked with there. But I just want to close with a little bit about Davis's legacy here. Some of you might have heard of Kinsey and his famous Kinsey reports. Yeah. His study of male sexuality, released in 1948. Female sexuality, of course, after that, 1953. What you may not know is that before he did that, he taught a so-called marriage course at Indiana University. This is his reading list from 1938, 1940. This is the entire list. That's all of it. There are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 people on there. The first two are Katharine Davis. But wait, there's more. So I have searched unsuccessfully for someone saying, I read this book, Factors in the Sex Life of 2,200 Women, and it changed my life. I thought I was abnormal. And she told me I was normal. I can't find it. What I found instead was a letter from Jeanette Foster to Alfred Kinsey. Jeanette Foster was a librarian. She also was a lesbian librarian. Jeanette Foster devoted her life to compiling a list of every single work of literature that discussed lesbianism. She was a lit person, but she read voraciously. And among other things, she read Davis's study. So in 1941, she wrote to Kinsey saying, "Ever since the appearance of Katharine Bement Davis's book on sex factors in the lives of college women, I've realized the value of objective case studies." And then she volunteered herself to be part of Kinsey's ongoing study and said that she would recruit all the lesbians she knew to participate as well. So Kinsey actually based his Kinsey scale on Davis's study. If you read his footnotes, you'll find it, although he doesn't own up to it in the text. So that's your overview of Katharine Davis. Thank you so much for your attention. I'm sorry I talked forever. It's a problem for me. But now we will leap the ocean, and Brandy will take over and tell us about Magnus Hirschfeld, Dora Richter, and the Institute for Sexual Science, or Sexual Study, or just call it Wissenschaft and be done with it.
Some of you may have noticed I walked in here with hair today, but I got hot, so I took it off. Hot flashes, it's miserable, really. I beat breast cancer last year. Yep. But I'm still growing my hair back, and I don't normally wear the wig, but it's freaking cold outside, and while we've been sitting here, it's been sunny and hailing at the same time. Do you get hail bows? Can you get hail bows? Is that like a thing that can happen? Yeah. Anyway, we used to get frozen fog in Minnesota, and they called it frog, so I suppose. So, anyway, shorter hair. This is a little bit more normal for me. But my name is Brandy Schillace, and I'm really excited to be here. I'm really happy that I was able to come to Missoula and be part of this amazing series of events. This is such an awesome town. I can't believe it. I sort of got here, and I was like, this is just like this little happy place. It's working out for me. Anyway, I'm really glad to be here. And this is the first of 3 events that I'm going to be doing in town. So I'm going to be talking a little bit today about Hirschfeld and about my book. But I'm also doing an outside, the fact and fiction folk are selling copies of that and my fiction book. Oh my God, I can't stand my lane. I also write fiction. I know. I am autistic, if that hasn't come across yet. Right, yeah, special interests all over the place. It's just insane, just a spiral. Anyway, at Fact and Fiction, I'm going to be talking about representation, LGBTQ representation in the Intermediaries, autism representation in my mystery fiction. So there's that. Then wait, there's more. See, I'm gonna, yeah. I'm doing it, I'm taking it. So if you can hold out until Monday. Monday I'll be at Shakespeare and Company, I believe at 7 p.m. And there I'm talking again about the Intermediaries, but it's comedy. I know it doesn't sound like there's funny things to talk about, but there are, and I promise you it will be kind of like stand-up, but with a message of hope at the end that's a little bit like Star Wars. You should probably come. And I'll wear my hair for at least one of these, and then you can see all the versions of myself. It'll be great. Okay, I'm going to start off my talk describing the hormone and the gene, because I'm a historian of medicine and science, and I focus a lot on the fringes and the edges, because she mentioned the Peculiar Book Club. I realize there's a lot of peculiar nonfiction because there's a lot of peculiar stuff in the world. And I am always looking for where are those untold stories, the things we don't really hear about, and how can we pull those into a narrative and tell a story about it. So the hormone and the gene are very small. Both of them are very tiny. And they were both sort of discovered around the same time. So the word hormone, Starling, Ernest Starling gives hormone its name in 1905, and William Bateson coins the term genetics, from which we get gene, also in 1905. And these are two different fields of study, from which one we get endocrinology and one we get genetics. And I thought how fascinating that they both start around the same time, but they give rise to two different kinds of pseudosciences as well. So the hormone discovery, endocrine discovery, it ultimately leads to people like Hirschfeld who say the hormone taught us something incredibly important about the body. And it leads them to thinking that there should be greater human diversity and that there's a natural variation in sexuality and gender. It also gives a couple of people the idea that we might be able to live forever if we take the serum of crushed dogs' testicles. We'll get there. But the other pseudoscience that the gene leads to is much more terrifying, because instead of going gene directly to genetics, we took a U-turn and we got eugenics. So think about this for a moment. Two sciences discovered around the same time, the same groups of people reading about it. One gives rise to the idea that there should be diversity and we should be accepting of LGBTQ people, and the other gives rise to genetics. And I start with this because it's very important to me to tell you, as a historian of science, that science does not speak for itself, and it is not apolitical. So often, in politics, on both sides, right? You have people saying, well, it's just the science, it's just the science. RFK Jr. uses the word science, not in the way I use the word science. So, science is not apolitical, it can take you in either direction, and I'm gonna talk a little bit about how that happens. But first we have to talk about rooster testicles. I know. This is the way science happens, right? Science isn't a thing, right? It's not a specific thing. It's a series of questions about the world, and we're trying to discover how things happen. And in the time, this is going back a ways now, in the 19th century, 18th century, and even further back, people had an idea that the brain, we'd figured out the brain was important, which is good. It is. Nerves are good. That's true. But look around the world at that time period. You had a lot of, there's kings and everyone else, and they were a lot of, God and everyone else. So there's a lot of this top-down kind of understanding of things. So they thought, okay, brain equals king, equals man, equals God, and it determines everything else that happens in your body. Therefore, everything that happens is a moral choice. So morality gets really mixed up in the way human bodies and behaviors come to be understood. And therefore, whenever somebody behaves in any kind of way that's not what is considered to be the normative and accepted route, no one said, oh, well, that's diversity. They said, you have sinned. So that's a problem. The brain and nerves dictate everything, but some people had questions about how. So Adolf Berthold had an abiding interest in testicles because he wanted to figure out how puberty happened, right? So what is the mechanism that gets from that God brain to puberty? How does that happen? And he decided to do some experiments on roosters. So he thought, okay, how does a chick become a rooster and not a hen? Let's figure this out. So he takes some young roosters that have not gone through rooster puberty yet, and he removes their testicles. And he does some very weird things. He swaps some around. We won't talk about that. The main important one is for some of them, he doesn't put the testicles back. They're just ball-free. The other ones, he puts the testicles back, but not where they belong, right? In the stomach. He puts them in the gut. Yeah. So, anyway, it turns out that the ones with no gonads, which is the proper term, even though it's a funnier sounding one, don't develop into roosters. They don't develop combs, they don't crow, they don't chase hens. In fact, they become rather hen-like and sort of fluffy and soft, and they got really sort of heavy as well. This is why we have capons. the ones that then he was like, okay, testicles, very important, got it. But the ones that he put the testicle back in the gut, they turned into roosters, just as if they were not messed with in the first place. And he thought, that is very strange. So he euthanized them, and he decides to open them up and figure out, aha, so how did the brain nerves reconnect to that testicle, right? Because the brain's doing everything. Lo and behold, no nerve tissue anywhere, just a vascular system. And he thought, well, that's weird. It's almost like there's something, a secretion. They were really, such a gross word, but they really liked it. It's almost like there's this secretion running through the blood-borne avenues of the body that's making you go through puberty, and it doesn't seem to have to do with the brain. How odd. Then he just forgets about it. So this gets put aside for a while, and we don't come back to this concept until someone named Charles Edward Brown Succard and his dog testicle experiments. He injects himself with crushed dog testicle juice, which I don't recommend. But again, there's some weird things happening. The reality is we don't actually figure out exactly what's going on until, oops, went too far, until Starling returns. Starling is also interested in invisible secretions. He's in Britain, and he's looking at a dog's gut. I know, we've already looked at guts and testicle guts. This wasn't that. He's looking at a dog's gut to figure out, does the brain tell you to salivate when you're hungry? And it turns out it doesn't. There's some other mysterious messenger. That turns out to be the hormone, which comes from the word meaning, it basically kind of means like arousal or movement and change. So, invisible tiny messenger, not from the brain, but somewhere in your body. And I like to call it welcome to the body proletariat. Because suddenly you have realizations that something small and invisible but all throughout your body is actually changing the way you are. And oddly enough, that was kind of happening politically around the world as well. So there's this sudden understanding that maybe the top-down hierarchy isn't quite right. So genes, we learned that genes carry inheritable messages through sperm and egg. Hormones communicate the messages as chemicals released into the body to influence traits. And once you know that, it has to change the way you think about morality and sin and sex. So if genes and hormones are responsible for making us as we are, then really small things lead to the great things. And secondly, nature, not religion, not the top-down, not original sin, nature is what causes this. This is a nature thing, not a choice. And if that's true, then you can be born this way. So when you get hormones and genes discovered, you start having people realize we are made by nature to be what we are. And that changes everything for a select few. And I want to talk partly about a fellow named Carl Henry Ulrichs, which the book is not about. But he was one of the first people to say publicly, I am not a sinner. He realized he was homosexual at a very young age. And his sister said, well, who did this to you? He's like, no, but I've been right here, like with you in the country. He just realized that was something of himself. And he said, that God made me this way, so therefore it cannot be sinful. And he writes about this. He publishes about it, he writes letters. And those letters will ultimately influence a man named Magnus Hirschfeld. And Magnus is an interesting guy. Magnus is Jewish. He's the son of a doctor, and as a result, is going to be a doctor too, as often happens. He's also homosexual, and he lives in a time after Carl lived before Germany kind of becomes one place. He's growing up in the time after Germany has unified, and they have taken on Prussia's laws, one of which is paragraph 175, that makes it illegal to be homosexual. And it's more broad than that. There's a whole lot of things that fall under it that make it possible for you to be arrested, lose your job, all kinds of other things because of the law. And failing to do that opens you up to potentially being blackmailed by people who know more about you and want to out you to other people. So he does become a physician. He does go to the World's Fair. He goes to the World's Fair as a journalist because he loved literature. He's a very literate guy, and he really wanted to be a writer, but he was the son of a doctor. So he goes to medical school. And he does become a doctor. He becomes kind of a general practitioner. He does a bunch of different things. But one of the great things that he realizes is that he can provide a safe space for his patients. He himself was not out publicly. He couldn't have done that and still practice medicine. But we know that his patients confided in him. So he was treating a young man who was quite depressed, and he had been sort of semi-truthful with Hirschfeld about some things, and he was getting ready to get married. And Hirschfeld finds out that he takes his own life on his wedding night. The man then, a letter arrives from this man posthumously to Hirschfeld's door, almost right around the same time he would be reading the obituary. And it's a letter from his patient who says, I took my own life because I can see no other way. I am homosexual, and my parents want me to marry this childhood friend, and I don't want to trap her in a loveless marriage, and I don't want to live a lie, and I don't want to disappoint my parents. And I can see of no other way out. Can't you do something to make life better for us? Which, wow, to throw that on your shoulders, right? But I also think it's very important to point out something here. Hirschfeld understood that his patient wasn't making a choice between life and death. He was making a choice between suffering and not suffering. At the time in Germany, they called, the word for suicide comes off as like criminal self-murder. And Hirschfeld was like, he wasn't murdered. He didn't murder himself. He was murdered. He was murdered by a society. He was a victim of people who don't understand. And he was talking about how this guy was doing this because he thought it was the right thing for other people he cared about, and how painful and horrible that was. And it basically changes Hirschfeld's life forever. And he moves in the direction of science leading to justice, and he never looks back. And I just think that's amazing. So this is the Institute for Sexual Science, as it was once. It was really an amazing place. He fights for this for a long period of time, so I'm not going to tell you. There's a huge, long part of my book is actually about the 19th century and how we ended up with hateful people in the world who couldn't understand. But just for the purposes of this, we're going to start here. This was this amazing palatial residence, and it had everything. I have to tell you what a wonderland this was. It's like Disney World. Like, this is 1918, and he opens up a center that has counseling, it has community care, it has community building, social support, it can help you get a job. This, like, anyone who's LGBTQ is just, come on over. Educational courses, a movie room, grand balls downstairs. They have a huge community dining room where everybody comes to eat. The patients, the doctors, everybody together, as if they're just all equal. He was literally treating people as a whole person. And they were performing gender affirmation surgeries and hormone therapy. This opened in 1918. It is unbelievable the things that they were doing. But what I was most amazed by is his emphasis on community. He understood that one of the biggest problems was that people didn't realize they were normal. And this is similar to what you were saying. They didn't realize that they were okay. Some of them grew up in rural areas. They'd never met another gay person. They just thought they were the only person like this, that there was something wrong with them, that they were sick or diseased. And that was also pushed by, even Kraft-Ebing, for that matter, who thought that you could fix it by subjecting people to really horrible treatments to try and, gay conversion therapy type stuff. And, they thought that they were the only ones. And so one of his emphasis was, we need to show you how to be in the world. So he would take people, literally, there's a prescription card where his prescription is, visit this gay bar. Because he's like, you need to go out and meet people. You need to see other people. They literally would take young, 18-year-old boys who were homosexual and say, okay, we're going to take you to the El Dorado Club, or we're going to take you, and we're going to show you how to date and what not to do and how not to get in trouble. And they led courses on how not to get blackmailed. I mean, they really understood what it was to build a community of people who felt normal in a culture that did not understand them. But he wasn't going to stop there. He spent the rest of his time trying to change the culture itself. And he was more successful than you might think. One of the things that I think is fascinating is that when we think about the period leading up to 1933 and everything that comes after it, we think of it as a failure, right? We think the Nazis came, they took everything away. But Hirschfeld did make change. He changed so much. They came so close so many times to overturning the law. And in fact, prior to World War I, there was a time of real acceptance, and he felt like, okay, we're really making progress. Then there was a backlash. Then, after World War I, with the Weimar Institute, he's like, okay, we're making progress again. And he just kept fighting that fight. And it's not failed because he also offered a whole lot of things that ended up at the Kinsey Institute. Some of the earliest LGBTQ movements for rights in this country and other countries owed themselves back to Hirschfeld. You can almost draw a direct line. So it's not as though this is a story of a failure. This is a story of an utterly mind-blowing success, and we don't know anything about it. And that's weird. That's what got me interested in the first place. How do we forget something like this? Well, we forget it and we don't. So most of you, I'm sure, have seen the big book burning. You've seen pictures, black and white films. It's a big pile. They're burning Hirschfeld's library. But most people don't know that. Isn't that odd? I was in high school. I saw those pictures in history books. No one ever told me that that's what they were burning. The Nazis didn't just want to burn the library. They wanted to expunge Hirschfeld and his institute from the face of the earth. And there's a reason for that. And I spent a lot of my time writing this book wondering what that reason was, because I thought, okay, how do you have the Weimar era, which has famous transgender drag clubs, and you can have Hirschfeld can sign a card for you that makes you officially allowed to basically wear the clothes of the opposite gender, etc. How do we have this amazing permissiveness, and how did we lose it? And spoiler, this might have some bearing on what we're going through today. So, how do we first begin to hate? And the answer is strange, because it actually starts in the 19th century with a hatred of women and a fear of change. So misogyny, anti-Semitism, and transphobia are friends. They didn't like the fact that the world was changing, and in Germany, women were going into the workforce. They were also trying to get the right to vote, etc. And in Germany, this created a crisis of masculinity. Not really. It created the illusion that masculinity was in crisis. And they said things like, our young boys aren't masculine enough anymore. They need to be Ubermensch. They need to be supermen. We need to make them amazing man boys who are not influenced by women at all. And their solution for this was to create boys' clubs where you took lots of pubescent boys going through the throes of puberty and sent them into the woods alone without supervision to make them more straight. So it backfired catastrophically. It did. These were called the von der Vogel movement, and they were headed up by somebody named Hans Bleuer. Hans Bleuer, he believed in something called Mannerbund. I'm probably not pronouncing that right, but it's basically man culture. And he believed that only men were smart enough to have conversations with other men, that all culture and art and anything good came from men, and women were like weird vessels that made babies that we didn't really need to do anything with. And unsurprisingly, Greek culture was very popular at this moment. There was a lot of like the lionizing of Greek, which, I mean, if you know anything about ancient history, like when the Romans came, it was actually better for women. Women were like, how is this better? But it is. So there was a real sense that, you know, we should follow the Greek way of looking at men and women. So Hans Bleuer said the male could not coexist with the female. There could be no feminine and masculine mixture of traits. It would violate the unbridgeable divide between sexes. He argued that women had no place in culture and that men who identified themselves in feminine ways should be treated as suffering at best a terrible sickness. So he didn't like men who behaved, in his opinion, feminine ways, but Hans Bleuer was also homosexual. But he wasn't like one of those girly homosexuals. No, no, no. He was masculine, Übermensch, Greek homosexual in his own eyes. And he became very interested in the masculinists. The masculine, come on in, come on in. No, I'm funny, go ahead, it'll be great. He became very interested in the masculinists who were, she was unconvinced, who were gay but also hated all things feminine. And Friedlander, Adolf Brand, there was a number of groups of people who fit into this category. And Hans Bleuer was very attracted to them, but he first made friends with Hirschfeld. So he starts off kind of like, maybe. Hirschfeld actually writes the introduction to one of his books, right? But then that backlash I was telling you about, the backlash against homosexuality and etc. And Hans Bleuer is getting afraid of getting caught in the crosshairs. So he promptly marries a girl and then publicly comes out and being like, I like girls, like this one. And I'm going to make babies. He literally said, like, and I'm going to make more of us. It'll be great. But that's not enough. So he decides to publicly say, and I'm so masculine that I wouldn't have anything to do with feminine, girly, Jewish men like Hirschfeld. He just throws Jews under the bus, just like that. And he does it because he claimed, and this is a common belief, weirdly enough in Germany, that Jewish men are feminine. So remember, he's against anything feminine, no men with any feminineness of any kind. And he claims Jewish men are feminine. And then he goes further to suggest that Jewish men, like Hirschfeld, are corrupting good German boys, and they're not going to be masculine if you let them hang out. So like I said, anti-Semitism just kind of gets sort of snuck in because it was easy. Anti-Semitism already existed. Bleuer didn't invent it. Hitler didn't invent it. They just used it. And it was Bleuer going, not me, not me, not me. Look at that guy. Again, Hirschfeld himself is still not out, but you have Bleuer being like, wait, you know. So Bleuer argues this, and Hans Bleuer's work gets picked up by the masculinists who are not gay, the rising nationalist group that would later become the Nazis. And they liked it a lot. So misogyny ends up becoming its own version of homophobia, and anti-Semitism becomes a shield against homosexual accusation. And Bleuer basically turns his back on Hirschfeld and the emancipation movement and champions what he calls the conservative revolution. Have you heard that before? You have. It's weird. Writing this book was weird, people. I would just like spend all day writing history and then go and watch the news and be like, no, but it's true. So, thus begins the purge. And when I say how we first begin to hate, I guess what I'm really saying is that hate is like a little weird seed, and it will, you know, or you know, it's rolling downhill and it's going to collect more hate. And so these groups that hated others start forming coalitions together. So women's rights threatened masculinity. Supposedly feminized men threatened masculinity. You know, for all their talk about Ubermensch and Supermen, masculinity seems under threat an awful lot. Feminization would lead to a weak nation and degeneration. Homosexuals, transgender people, the disabled, they're all blamed for degeneration. Everyone's blamed for degeneration. And they wanted to remasculinize everybody. They even suggested they have a war. There were people saying, we just need a good war. That will remasculine all of our boys. Actually, it just basically deleted an entire generation of young men. But you have eugenics and race hygiene and all these things getting in through that door, through that hateful door. And we went from a period of time where we were bordering on acceptance to this creep of creeps, to this creep of what would become a very militarized action against homosexuals and transgender people and anyone else who didn't fit into this little tiny box that they created. So science is only as successful as scientific communications, ethics, and human-centered as we can make it, right? You have to be out there fighting for it. And he was fighting for it. I just want to mention that Hirschfeld was fighting for this the whole time. Hirschfeld didn't give up. He actually had reverse propaganda. When they would do propaganda, they had a printing house inside the Institute too, by the way. And so they would just print off all kinds of like pro-homosexual, and just leaflet everywhere. They were just like, we're good, gay is good, have some gay. And it was great. And that was how people knew that they were a safe place. And he had educational videos, he did the film. The film gets promptly banned, by the way, by the Weimar, which you'd think would be more progressive, but it gets banned. And he just starts showing it privately at the Institute. So everyone's watching it, everything's going on, it's great. He's not giving up the fight. He doesn't actually think that this is the end, right? And of course, we know that they burn the library. We know that they ransack it. We know that the Nazis ultimately come. We are always saying how it can't happen here. 20,000 books total, 35,000 pamphlets and photographs and case studies, streets hung with swastikas. But despite all of that carnage, an awful lot gets out because Hirschfeld publishes all over the place in multiple languages. People smuggle things over the border. Levi Lenz, who is a surgeon I'm going to talk about in a minute, he literally escapes like hours before they get there, like carrying all the things that he can. People saved what they could. And they saved the feeling of community support and all of the things that we need to fight back. What I want to talk about for the rest of this time, though, is how joy becomes a weapon. Because I think, okay, I've given you the very quick and dirty of like how we got into that position, but how do you fight back? Leaflet dropping is one, but really, joy is how you fight back. Community is how you fight back. This is the part of the talk where I feel like I'm telling you things we need to know right now. So, a life lived authentically and in joy is an act of radical resistance. And now I'm going to tell you about someone named Dora Richter. So this is Dora. Now, Dora was born and christened Rudolf Richter in a village called Siphon, which was in the Ore Mountains, in the kind of Bohemian region. Tiny little town, like 1,000 people, like a little tiny town. And she was born to, her father was a musician, her mother was a lace maker. And this is where she was born. She grew up there. By the time she was 3 years old, that's the point at which they want kids to stop wearing they wear little gowns and put the boys in trousers and the girls in dresses. This is a 3-year-old Dora, at the time still called Rudolph, going, I don't wear trousers though. I wear dresses. And just threw an absolute fit. They screaming and hollering and carrying on, would not. So at the earliest age, she identifies herself as a girl like her sisters. This carries on through all of her childhood. When she's 13, she actually attempts to remove her penis because she doesn't know why she has one. She's like really upset about it. So when she pretends to be ill, everyone goes to church. she first tries to wrap a string around it, thinking that she can strangulate it off the way you do a wart. Very dangerous thing to do, and she's caught. She's caught doing, like, she gets really sick as a result. Her parents catch her, they yell at her, they carry on. So then she thinks maybe she can cut it off using her father's razor. But she's afraid of the sight of blood, so she can't do it, and as a result, she takes a bunch of pins and nails, puts them in a loaf of bread, and swallows it, trying to commit suicide. She is 13. She has never met a gay person. She lives in the mountains in a tiny village. And I like to tell this story not because she lives and thankfully she was okay, but I tell this story because when people try to say that you got it off TikTok or TV or YouTube, no, she was like this from the time she was little, not influenced by anyone else. Failing at killing herself, she begins to make a plan for how she can kind of live the life she wants around the edges of what society demands. So Dora gets sent off to school, and this is exciting for her because she's like, okay, no one's watching me now. So she goes to school during the day. She's trained to be an apprentice baker. She's going to apprentice classes in kind of a school training center. And she takes her extra money and she buys a dress and a wig. And so during the day, she's at school, but she's fallen for her one classmate. But she doesn't want to tell him that she feels this way because she doesn't love him as a boy. She loves him as a girl. So she starts writing love notes to him and tells him to meet her by the woods. And she dresses up. She's about 16, 17 now. And she meets her boy, and she ends up, like, they woo, and she ends up having her first boyfriend and her first sexual experience. And she does this by just not letting him look anywhere down there. She's very excited about this, and everything's going pretty well until the season of masquerade comes along. And they're all going to go to this party dressed up in costume. And of course, Dora's using this as a reason to dress up as a girl. So she dresses up as like a cute little barmaid person. But of course, now she's got the wig on, and she goes to the party, and people are like, oh, you should meet our friend so-and-so. And she's like, oh, crap. And he realizes that Dora is also his classmate, and that ends their relationship. And she's very sad and very heartbroken about this, but she learns from it. So she's like, okay, got to make sure that nobody sees the alter ego. So she ends up living kind of a double life, off and on. She's Dora whenever she can, and then when she has to go to work or et cetera, and she tries to keep her life separate, including going to other towns to date people, and then like back over here where no one knows. And that's how she kind of manages her relationships. She is so sweet. Like, she's still sending all this money back to her family and her parents and doing all the things that she, is trying to be a good older child to them. They take a lot of advantage of Dora. Everyone seems to, actually. She just wants to give things to people, so she gets kind of taken advantage of a lot. But in one of her parents finally say, look, you have to marry a woman, for heaven's sake. You can't play like this anymore. And this is after World War I, and so she actually tries. She dresses up, she just feels like she's wearing all weird. It's so strange, right? And she tries dating a girl, and it goes horribly wrong. And so she can't even do that, and she's just so heartbroken. Goes back to her life of masquerade balls, gets another boyfriend who asks her to marry him. And she panics, and she leaves without ever telling him why. And she goes and she lives in a farm all by herself, raising birds. She talks to these doves that she has, and she's telling I know all this because, by the way, there is an intake interview when she first goes to the Institute. It was very hard to find in Berlin, but I did get it. And she talks about talking to her birds and like, why can't people just let me be as I am? How come I can't be loved as who I am? How come I have to fake and hide? How come I can't be loved as who I am? But Dora's story gets better. Dora never gets to see Hirschfeld's film. It's banned. She never hears about Hirschfeld, doesn't know who he is. Until this is really a proof of the fact that Hirschfeld has been influential. So much of his time is spent educating people that Dora ends up in a relationship with a fella in another town who tracks her to where she lives and accidentally sees her as a man. And she tells him, "Oh, I'm so sorry, I realize this is the end of our relationship." And he goes, "Well, so there's these people," and he starts telling her, he tells her about how, like, some people are like this. And she's like, "Where?" Like, where are other people like me? And he informs her, he takes her to go see a different film, which references Hirschfeld's film. And she finds out, basically, her boyfriend's like, "We need to go to Berlin." And what a guy, right? And so she ends up going to Berlin and meeting Hirschfeld. And Hirschfeld interviews her. He's so taken with her, he renames her Dorchen, my little Dora. And not only does he agree to take her in and treat her, she doesn't have any money. Like, she's really poor. She has sent everything back to her family almost all of her life. Instead, he's like, "Okay, what if you work here? And then that way, that would be like in lieu of," right? Like, she also got paid too. But so she works there. She works at the Institute next to Hirschfeld. She ends up being kind of like this funny den mother to all the others. So whenever someone comes in and goes through transition to become a trans woman at the Institute, and they have trouble finding jobs, Hirschfeld just hires them. So she's like this den mother to all these other, like, lovely little trans girls down in the downstairs, and they, like, make lace together and sit by the fire. And so she has this life. She ends up going through this transition, and she ends up changing Hirschfeld's mind. Again, because science is about changing your mind when you find out new stuff. Hirschfeld was wrong about a lot of stuff. He originally thought there were only trans women and that there weren't trans men. So Dora helps him. Well, Gerd Katter, who was one of the trans men that went through the clinic by threatening to cut her own, they treated her. So Gerd Katter helps him misunderstand that. Also, he thought all trans women loved women. He thought that that's how that worked. Then here's Dora, who loves men. So, like, he just kept, like, "I got to write another book," and he would. And there'd be another book about the gradually changing understanding. He didn't have, originally they were called transvestites, but that didn't feel right, even to Hirschfeld. And so he started using this term, the intermediaries, to describe people who were in between. He said that they're part of this grand natural diversity. And he said, and I'm not lying, and I have checked this number repeatedly, there must be about, he worked out a formula, 43 million combinations of how sex and gender can go together. I was like, that's not a spectrum, that's that's all of it, right? And he basically said, I'm learning. And so Dora teaches him, and Gerd Katter teaches him, and he learns. And then he would bring politicians in to hear him talk about like this, and he would have the transgender patients come and be like, "Okay, so here's how this works. Here's what I'm like. Here's who I am. Here's what it's like to be me." And they would listen. They would be part of the program. They weren't just talked about. Do you understand? They were part of it. Yeah. Talk about progressive. We barely have that now. So Dora Richter lives at the Institute. This is Dora Richter in her workaday lady clothes. This is in her party clothes. And over here is in this lovely floral dress. They're out in the garden because they were on Tiergarten Square. And they would all have tea together. And by the way, they weren't the only ones there. W.H. Auden, Christopher Isherwood, they lived at the Institute. Like, there were all these famous authors kind of wandering in. And Carl, who was the lover to Hirschfeld, he was also there, and he was a little bit of a gossip and would tell them all the things about everybody. And it was just a lot of fun. It was just a wonderful, fun place. So Dora is just joyful. She's unsinkable. And bad things happen to her. And she lives here up to and through. Her surgery is like right up to the door of 1932. 1933 is when they stormed the place. But she lived the whole time with happiness and joy. And these people were having balls and exhibiting and experiencing joy this whole time. And I tell you this because when stuff gets dark, we start feeling like we shouldn't be happy about things. Well, how can we have a parade? Look at the world. How can I be excited about the next episode of my show? Look at the world. I don't deserve this. Look at the world. That's bull. Joy is a weapon because the other side doesn't have it. They can't control it. They don't understand it. They ultimately eat themselves up from the inside. Joy is our weapon. And the other thing I want to say is living authentically. Living authentically is huge. So if you or anyone you know is out there living their best life, doing their best to be authentic to themselves, and maybe they're not marching, and maybe they're not, and they're thinking, oh, I'm not doing anything. Just being authentically you is a weapon. So you are part of the resistance. You are part of the resistance. Dora never held, never held a gun. She was never somebody who was war-bound. They even tried to conscript her into the service, but when they asked her about blood and guns, she passed out. So she was just not well-suited for that, right? But yet she was a weapon of destruction against Nazi hatred. And what's really great is that originally when I started this research, we thought Dora died in 1933. We actually thought that she had been killed. She wasn't. And I only know this, not just because of my own research, but because part of my research was contacting everyone else who was doing research, including people who have no degree, who are just transgender people looking for pioneers. And Clara Hartman is one, and she was out there and she was looking at birth records and she was looking at census data, and we discovered something amazing. Dora outlived the Nazis. She lived long enough to know who the Beatles were. She died an old lady. We don't know where we know where she died in terms of the town. There's no marker or anything for her grave because she didn't die like she wasn't like this famous transgender person. She was just some lady, which is exactly what she wanted. And one of the greatest memories, Clara went, and some of the very, very old people in the village who were very, very young when Dora was still alive said they remembered her because she had a pigeon, pet pigeon, that she kept in her purse. And so she would go to like dinner or lunch or whatever, and you would see her like, and then you'd be like, ooh, and you're like, so they remembered her as this laughing, smiling woman who kept a bird in her purse, and that's her legacy of joy that outlived hatred. So that was at the darkest time that we think of in our timeline, and if we can have joy and balls and dancing, and if that's what it takes to outlive the darkness, we can do it now. This quote begins my book, which is, it is absurd to, this is Oscar Wilde, it is absurd to say that the age of miracles is past. It has not yet begun. And then I have a little video to play you, and then we're gonna play River's video, are we not? Okay, so I'll play you a little video. I commissioned a song, and I think I mentioned to you I'm autistic. That means not just special interest, but like a lot of hyper focus. So I do stop motion animation. So I commissioned a song from a transgender musician and her friend, and this is the song, and this is the stop motion animation that I did to go along with it. Whoops, that's the video. Hang on, it's the wrong one. There we go.
Joy, she wants to be held by a boy. Can't keep Dora down, she's gonna look her best. Go get that caress, put on a dress, and go into town. She's gotta be loved, it's what her heart is made of. Hard to ignore a Dora who wants more. What life's for, give her some room. This flower's in bloom.
She sings and threads, stitches and wishes, weaving her world to a life that she owns.
a girl, her mother taught her to make lace. Who is to say what's a mistake or is it fate? Maybe life isn't what you find, but what you create. Not something you wait for, no, not Dora. It's something you'll make. Every thread in its place, like perfect lace.
She sings and threads, stitches and wishes, weaving her world to a life that she owns. Aniline stains on her apron and fingers, pulling out crumbs for a purse for the birds. Growing as old as she can, she's always her own girl. She's always her own. She's always her own girl. She's always her own.
I'm not going to cue up River's video, which is lovely. I've watched it. You guys are going to love it.
There's something special about this place we call Montana. Just as magnificent as the land itself are the people who call it home. The history of Montana is diverse, from indigenous people who have always made this place their home, to immigrants who came here from countries all over the world. There is no question that two-spirit, trans, and gender-diverse people have always lived here, and their stories make up some of the most vibrant and interesting parts of our shared history. The lives of these people were so important to the community around them that even in death, their stories have the ability to move us and affect how we view the world. Today, the political landscape has caused many in the queer community to question our relationship to Montana. In fact, many people are leaving the state. So as we come together, it is those stories that we aim to tell as we reaffirm our place in Montana history and fight for a better future. Listen to a few of their stories now and join us in celebrating our past, recognizing our present, and working for a future where every Montanan feels welcomed here.
I mean, for the past decade, but especially these past 5 years, has been like increasingly polarized. Where like we had in 2016, we had this wonderful moment where it felt like we were moving forward, we were moving into a more progressive time. Queer people were being empowered to come out. Movies like Love, Simon were coming out and like being like, hey, like this, I mean, you know, say what you will about those movies in terms of representation. It felt like this moment, you know, like I talked about earlier of like, I'm allowed to be queer. I'm allowed to embrace this identity. It's something that the world is coming to accept, that Western culture especially is coming to accept. And then the 2016 elections happened, and Trump became president. And it didn't immediately feel like backsliding, but it definitely changed something in the culture. And I started to become like, you know, as his term progressed and he started to figure out what it actually, like what you can actually do as president, I started to become like a little more afraid of the people around me. I stopped trusting people as much. It became hard to know who I could like give my identity, give myself to, and trust them to respect that.
Political climate in Montana is, for as a queer person, it's only getting worse, and I don't foresee it getting better soon. Yeah. So I think there's a big, and obviously there's a national shift that I'm not a big fan of either. Yeah. And so from a safety standpoint, it doesn't feel like it's safe to return to Montana.
In Montana, speaking of the Munsters, it felt like we were real outsiders in a place that we had lived our entire lives. Like minor things, big things, just the way people treat you, the way, you know, people interact with you, you know, just like living your life and doing things that you would do in your life, how much easier that feels out here without constantly like looking over your shoulder or constantly just feeling everyone's glare on you.
Caught up in talking about, oh, I need to leave and move to a place that's safer. And it's just like, yeah, a lot of people do that. I know people who are trans that will not leave here because it's their home.
Mm-hmm.
And they just will not leave their home.
Yeah.
And like, I'm lucky enough that I don't feel that way, but I've lived places where I have felt that way.
Yeah.
Like, I know there's a lot of trans people in the South who will just never leave because that's their home.
Yeah.
And it's sad to feel like you have to choose between staying and being hidden or unsafe and leaving like a place that feels like it has a piece of your soul in it. And I feel like people just don't talk about that enough when they're talking about like, oh, I have to move to a sanctuary state. It's like, yeah, you have to get up and move, and that's sad, but like, despite the place you live being unsafe for you, it's still your home. And I think there's a lot of people that would just rather their home be safe than have to leave it. Give it up for River.
So we're going to bring up the lights, and we're all going to come sit up here. I want to let you know that the Montana Career In and Out project, which River was part of the team, who participated in phase one, and the film features folks who were in phase one, and that was all this last year. And that one because of the need to capture those stories before people left the state or became unreachable, really kind of focused on mostly trans and non-binary people either leaving the state or who had already left, in the case of Charlie, for example, whose voice you heard. And then some of them have since left. Parker, whose voice you heard, also has since left and gone to California. They might be watching now, though. Hi, Charlie, you're here. Johnny, you're here. Hi. But phase two is going to launch this fall, and for phase two, we're planning on casting a much bigger net for LGBTIQ2S plus folks who've lived in the state for any period of time, as well as family members, healthcare providers, educators, politicians, activists, etc. So that's ongoing. So if you're interested in learning more about the Career In and Out Oral History Project, please let me know afterwards, and I will hook you up. But for now, we have some time for Q&A. I'm afraid that mic might have actually died.
That one's up there. Yeah. This one's still working right now, so we'll be okay.
So we're good.
Question. It's low.
So what you got for us?
Oh, sorry.
Thank you. This was really an amazing panel and presentation, so thank you all for your work. Anya and Brandy, can you talk a little bit about how you came to study these particular scholars or activists?
Sure. Because really dark.
We'll project.
Yeah. We'll give it our best. I'll project better if I'm standing up. So for me, I came to it because, are we okay? Can we just kind of shout at you? Is it good? Not good? Okay, well, I guess I need to be all right, we'll just run it big. It'll be fine. Or people can ask questions and we can repeat it into the mic. Sorry. I had written an article about Michael Dillon, who was the first person to have a phalloplasty, and that was connected to a facial reconstructive surgeon who was doing facial reconstruction in World War I. That my friend Lindsay Fitzharris wrote a book called Facemaker. It's a similar kind of connection to that story. And it was while I was researching that, I came across mention of Hirschfeld and the Institute, and I thought, why don't I know about that? That seems strange. And as the more I researched, I wrote an article first for Scientific American. In addition to getting lots and lots of views and lots of attention, it made me an enemy of J.K. Rowling's. Yeah, and every time she does something, people send her my article. So like I'm like this horrible, like I haunt her accidentally. But anyway, so I got chased off Twitter by a bunch of JKR stands, and I thought, wow, this has really got people's attention. Maybe I should write a book. So that's where mine came from.
So I have a really different kind of origin story for mine. So I teach U.S. women's history, and in my circles, which admittedly are not everyone's circles, everyone has heard of Katharine Bement Davis and her pioneering study of women's sexuality. I mean, everyone knows about this study, but nobody knows about her because there's no collection of her papers in any archive. Well, there is, but not a publicly available archive. And so this is someone I've known about for a really long time. I've quoted her in my classes forever, but nobody's ever written a book about her because there's like no archive. So even though she's all over the newspaper and she published a lot of other things other than factors, there just really wasn't enough there to write a book. But when I was finishing up my last book and I was searching for a new project, and it was the very beginning of the COVID pandemic, and the world was shut down, I got an email out of the blue, and it turned out that her great niece, Francie Garber Pepper, when her own mother died, had been emptying out literally her mother's closet and found a closet full of Katharine Bement Davis memorabilia, including her never finished, never published memoirs, letters, memorabilia, her badge from when she was Commissioner of Correction. And Francie had dreamed of writing a book about her, and she and her sister Helen, hi Helen, had collected additional information, which they'd added to what I call the closet collection. But Francie had come to the realization that she was never going to be able to finish that book herself. And so she asked me if I was interested in doing it. And that is how I came to be working on this book, because Francie gave me exclusive access to the closet collection, which is no longer in a closet, by the way. But that's how it came about. Thank you for your question. I'm going to maybe hand the mic. Can I give it to you, Amy? Is that okay?
Yeah. Any other questions?
My question's for River. I was going to see how hard was it to choose what to put in the film. It was really good, but I felt like, oh my gosh, I bet there was so much to parse through and choose from. So thank you. And thank you so much for being here and for the presentation. It was all amazing. Yeah.
I'm not running. Sorry, I've got a bad knee.
I can run. That's okay.
All right. Yeah, that's a really good question. So I had one other researcher on who did a lot of these interviews. I think one was done by Charlie too, but Aaron Heaton did a lot of them. So between us, we each did like 20 interviews. They were like 2 hours each. So we had a lot of hours of material to go through, essentially. I think it was really like the interviews I remembered doing the most is the ones I chose. I knew Charlie's was going to be impactful. I knew Parker's was going to be impactful. I did Vic's towards the end. It was one of the last interviews I did, and that one quote about people's homes needing to be safer, people not wanting to leave home, and it's just sad that the place that we live is not safe anymore. The way that they articulated that, I remember that sticking with me for weeks after I did it. I'm also trans. A lot of these people are my friends that I did in these interviews with. Charlie's my friend, Parker's my friend, Vic is also my friend, and so it was very hard. And I went in knowing it was going to be very hard, but we did these interviews over the course of us starting to do it right before the election to us like doing it right after the election. So for Aaron and I, both a lot of emotional labor was going into it, but it was very rewarding. I was very happy and honored to be taking care of these stories of a lot of my mentors and friends. Yeah.
Thank you.
I'm worried. Oh, it's a loud thing. Okay. Thanks for the presentations and the film. A question for Brandy, because of his Hirschfeld's and the Institute's papers being burned and books and so forth. So when you started your research, and I imagine some things that had been published were in other places, or how did you then, how did you go about it? Or are they in the Federal Archive in Germany or in various other archives?
So partly, some of the answer to this I will deliver in a much more humorous fashion on Monday if you guys come, because some stuff happened, and it's kind of crazy how everything came about. I mean, for one thing, I was doing this during the lockdown. I had to travel to Germany under all kinds of restrictions. I arrived immediately as the Ukraine conflict started, and there were refugees pouring into Berlin, and there were people walking around with like very large guns, and there was razor wire. I mean, a lot was happening. But also the difficulty of getting things out of Berlin cannot be understated. But I'll make it funny on Monday. The other thing I would say is translation was a real issue, because it's not about just translating out of German. I had to find, I went searching for a translator who worked principally with late 19th century medical texts, which was, there's like one person. So it was a very expensive and slow process, because I had to have the exact right way of saying it in English, and she was amazing. So there was that. There was also what I call it's like the transgender brigade. It was just everyone else doing research and like contacting all of them and finding out who was finding what where, because many of them weren't researchers, so they have it on their blogs, or they had it, getting tons and tons of original materials. The way the book is written, just so you know, I intended this to be for scholastic use. So even it reads, trust me, it reads like an adventure story. There's your Star Wars part. But in the back, I have the biggest bibliography I've ever compiled in my life, and it uses all the versions of everything that is there, and it has timelines, and it has biographies of the various people and glossaries and stuff. But it was like putting my brain through a ricer, That's what it was like. But it was very, very hard. It was definitely, this took me twice as long to write as any other book I've written, and this is my 6th book. So.
We probably have time for one more question, and then we'll all be around a bit for for informal chats as well. But one more official question.
Hello. Oh my gosh, this is nuts. Okay, my question is for River. You were talking a lot about the kind of emotional labor that goes into this research. How, or what are some best practices for some other folks that are looking to do similar research for you to kind of center joy and kind of not be fully distraught and, inconsolable and whatnot? What are some strategies that you and some other folks would take part in?
Thank you, Lorelai. So this work is really difficult, especially for trans folks that are researching trans folks that lived in the past. I genuinely think, though, the more I look at trans history and the way that these people are, the things about them, even learning about Dorothy and being like, oh, like she was a bird lady and like loved all these birds. I probably know trans women who like do similar things today. that reminds me of like some of my friends. So just there's some magic to me about that connection throughout time, because like I look at some of the pictures we have from the Hirschfeld archives and stuff and feel like I could walk into that room and know people who look like me in that space. So that's a big part of it. Another big part of it is just being like mega intentional about my self-care regimes, knowing that this was going to be a lot for me, and like just being like, basically I'd block out the days I did my interviews and be like, I can't do anything after this. Like I'm doing this interview, and there I learned so much about myself. I learned so much about my community. This doing queer history stuff has been a dream of mine since as long as I can remember, really taking hold in like 11th grade when I wrote a paper for my English class being like, hey, we should have queer history in public schools. Why don't we? And I feel like we're getting, even in the midst of like everything that's going on, I really feel like we're getting closer and closer to that being a reality in Montana, which is what is pushing me forward. Because the more people that know that there are Montanans that look like me, that look like my friends, that look like people you know, that lived here and have a direct history to this land, the more powerful I think that message and that hope becomes. So yeah.
Thanks for that great question. And River, thanks for that great answer. So I just want to mention, so as Brandy mentioned, she has a couple of more events coming up, but her book is also here if you'd like to get it now and have her sign it. But also, because I'm sure that she's going to be like mobbed, we have another really cool thing, which River also worked on, which is this new exhibit right back there called Crossings. This is, it was going to be a sneak peek with just one of the panels, but instead it's the world premiere. Woohoo! And not everyone who worked on it could be here today, but I want to acknowledge Sierra, who is hiding. Come on, Sierra. And River, who were two of the researchers for this super cool exhibit that's about 200 years of lives of people who we would now describe as being two-spirit and transgender in Montana. So I encourage you to hang around for the next half hour or so, check out the exhibit, grab a book or two. Actually, Brandy has 2 books here today. Get some signature, chat with any of us, chat with each other, and celebrate joy.
I want to thank Anya. Anya has been amazing for pulling all of this together. And I'm here because of Anya. I'm so pleased to be here as a result. And you know how much work she's done. So I think extra round, because... Did I say earlier? Yesterday I was like, women academics, get it done. If you did not come here prepared to buy a book, you can come tomorrow. And tomorrow I'll be talking about autistic representation in mystery fiction, which I also write, as well as transgender representation in nonfiction. The sequel to the book that's out there is coming out August 5th and it introduces, because you can't have enough, a transgender character to the story with the autistic character. So now they're all together. It's like my magnum opus. So I hope you'll come back. And thank you again, Anya. Seriously. Oh, tomorrow? What is tomorrow's?
I think tomorrow is 6.
It's fact and actually, he's out here. You can ask him. He'll be there. And then again on Monday, if you want comedy Hope Night, stand-up Brandy comedy Hope Night, that's at 7 at Shakespeare and Company. So thank you.
Thank you all so much for coming. I'm going to turn off the microphone.